This is The Energy Show with REI Energy. Energize your investments and maximize your tax deductions. Here's Mike Mauceli.
My name is Mike Mauceli, and this is The Energy Show with REI Energy, where we're energizing your investments and maximizing your tax deductions. Today, we're going to be talking with Mark Mills. Mark is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and faculty fellow at Northwestern University McCormick School of Engineering. Mark served in the White House Science Office under President Reagan. You're going to discover how the new Green Deal triggered that Autoworker strike, which will likely result in higher prices for you. Well, Mark, thank you for coming on the show today. You know, there's been a lot of talk out there, and of course, as we see every day now with the automotive strike, that a lot of the employees are actually striking because they feel that they're not going to work as much during the manufacturing of these electric vehicles. And I know you talk a lot about electric vehicles and, you know, and some of the things. So I really wanted to kind of get your opinion on why are we actually having an auto strike in the first place?
Well, you know that expression, it's always about the money.
Yeah. No,
I've said this before. I wrote as much, as you know, that I'm sympathetic to them for a couple of reasons. I'm not a fan of strikes because it's economically destructive, and I know they know that, right? This is for historic context. I think the United Auto Workers Union is nearly 90 years old, so it's been around almost a century, like the auto industry, and it's the first time that the union has struck all three automakers in history. So it's a pretty epic strike by historic standards. And that's, I think, motivated by an epic spending, in my view, misallocation of capital by the government and automakers at levels that are unprecedented in history. The Inflation Reduction Act, as you know, has been properly renamed, even by its advocates, as the Green New Deal. It's not hundreds of billions, but when costed out properly by both Wood Mackenzie and Goldman Sachs, the legislation has somewhere on the order of $2 to $3 trillion of spending planned in the, quote, energy transition, more than half of which is directed at cars and the car sector. So we're talking over $1 trillion of spending, not spent, but planned. So if you're the auto workers and you're looking at this magnitude of money being thrown around, not to be facetious, you'd kind of say, well, okay, where's my piece of this? This is epic amount of money. It's disruptive to the industry with this magnitude of government intervention. And disruptions are not always good when they're forced by governments. This is not the illusion. This is a natural disruption. There's an inevitable transition away from internal combustion engines to battery-powered cars is an illusion. There is no natural transition. There's a natural addition to the pantheon of choices in cars, a really interesting and exciting addition, I'd say, in a model of car or cars that could be battery powered with a lot of the features that batteries offer. So it's a big deal in the history of automotive industry to add a significant new option. It's kind of like the equivalent of transitions and additions of combining, let's say, the automatic transmission with the SUV with anti-lock brakes. I mean, if you think of the combination of those changes in the models of cars added a lot of features to cars. Adding battery propulsion adds features that are different and exciting to lots of people. But it's just not a revolution in transportation. It's an addition of a class of model of car. But the amount of money being thrown at forcing a transition, literally forcing, and if not banning, as you know, the sale of internal combustion engines in 12 states by 2030, 2032, and the de facto banning of the manufacture of internal combustion engine cars by the EPA. If the EPA's rule goes into effect, the proposed tailpipe rule, it will mean, this is not me saying this, is widely reported, it's the intention, it will force automakers to produce essentially only EVs. About 2/3 to 3/4 of all the vehicles they will be able to manufacture by 2030 or so will have to be EV. So a long way of saying the auto workers are looking at this saying, You guys are blowing the whole thing up. We're on the short end of the stick. We need to get a piece of something here. Plus the work week and raises and all the rest. This is normal, and I get that. But I think you're right. The underlying animation is this massive disruption.
Well, when you look at the EV industry, I guess, and like you said, it all comes back to fossil fuels, right? The war on fossil fuels and doing away with the internal combustion engine. And, basically manufacturing these electric cars that are so far, out of price for the normal American. I mean, they are great cars and they're beautiful looking cars. And, I see them around town all the time. But how many people can actually afford a $70,000 automobile? And so as the government forces this electric technology on us. I mean, there's been a lot of times in the past where first, they came out and they said that, well, we're going to go to hydrogen cars, and then we're going to go to natural gas cars. We're going to use natural gas to power our cars. And now we've come to, completely destroying the fossil fuel industry and going to electric cars. But isn't it true? And I think I read a lot of your articles that basically talked about that building electric cars just actually isn't as clean as everyone lets out, or it's not as green, I guess, is the buzzword that right. Everyone says it is, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's three core tenets or myths about EVs, electric vehicles, that anchor the idea of a forced transition. One is, as you know, that the claim is that electric vehicles, battery powered cars, are inherently simpler, and therefore ultimately will be cheaper and easier to build. That's the claim. Even if they're expensive now, to your point, they're going to get cheap fast because they're simpler, right? That's claim one. Claim two is that they're going to be more convenient to operate. Just plug it in, right? We just build a few charging stations and ba-booms. It's easier, simple, plug it in. So there's the claim that with this transfer from gasoline to electric charging is better, simpler, more convenient, plugging it at home. And the third claim, of course, to your point, is that and it's not about being clean. The claim is that they radically reduce the emissions of carbon dioxide by eliminating combustion engines, right. And we get this big CO2 reduction. The whole motivation for the mandates and subsidies is on the third. So we're going to cut CO2, but don't worry, the vehicles are going to be better, simpler, and cheaper. The problem is all those claims are not true. And just to summarize, although I wrote, as you know, a very long paper this past summer and published it, I tried to make it a short paper, and I apologize. It's easy to get. It's free. It's called The Impossible Dream. And I document with, I think, 200 or 300 citations. This is not me trying to be mean to Elon Musk. I admire him. It's not me saying that EVs aren't nice. They are. And I'm not saying there aren't going to be lots more EVs. There'll be millions more yet. There's lots of rich people in America and Europe who like them or will buy them. But the three tenets are not true. The idea that they're simpler because the electric motor that drives it is simple is a misdirection. It's a complexity swap. The battery is complicated. It's a half-ton machine with thousands of parts, thousands of welds, electronic control systems, safety systems, and cooling systems. So a complicated fuel system and a simple motor versus a simple fuel system, a gasoline tank with a single pump, and a complicated internal combustion engine with hundreds of parts. Although I will point out that internal combustion engines exist with 3 moving parts. In fact, some with even 2. As simple as an electric motor. There are no batteries are that simple, but there are internal combustion engines that are. So that claim is not true. But what's important about that is that underlying the battery is a quantity of specialty minerals, energy minerals, not just lithium, but manganese and nickel and copper and aluminum, cobalt, graphite, not graphene, manganese. There's a suite of energy minerals, the quantity of which is astonishingly high. These are half-ton batteries, which require mining something on the order of 200 tons of earth to make a single car. It's a battery. So in that fact, you find the rest of the deconstruction of the myth that that mining entails a lot of costs. Those costs are not amenable to rapid reductions because mining is a big, slow-moving industry. So you're not going to see rapid reductions in those costs. The mining industry isn't and can't expand fast enough to meet the demands for the quantities. And the mining itself is energy intensive. It's a global industry. Most of it's not here and involves the emissions of carbon dioxide significant enough to offset much, if not all, of the emissions you eliminate by not burning gasoline in the first place.
Well, it sounds like, I mean, when they do this type of mining, is a lot of it so-called strip mining, or is it deep mining and like mining for coal, where you're basically digging deep mines to bring the material up? Is that the type it is?
It's all kinds of mining because it depends on the mineral. And what's different between mining for energy minerals versus coal, for example, and oil and gas, is that in environmental terms, it's far more challenging, or if you're an environmentalist, it's far more destructive. Your coal seams are very highly concentrated. So the so-called strip mining for coal or underground mining is that the ratio of the amount of stuff you dig up to the amount of stuff you need is very tight. That is, if you want a ton of coal, you have to move maybe 1.25 tons of the earth, right? But you get a ton of coal. If you want a lot of oil and gas, you drill pinholes, in effect, in the ground, and you're not moving essentially any earth. You're drilling pinholes down thousands of feet and extracting pressurized gas and oil. As you know, not a lot of material moved. But to get the copper and nickel and manganese and lithium, you have to move somewhere between 50 to 1,000 tons of earth for each ton of the material you're trying to get. Wow. Because these minerals are rare. Now, it depends on the kind of mine. So some copper mines, you can find pictures of them on the magic YouTube machine. Some copper mines are holes that are 1 or 2 miles across and 1 mile deep in the earth to get to. These are open pit mines. Some are subsurface mines. Some are strip mines for different minerals. But it's an extremely challenging industry to execute the acquisitions in ways that we in the West find acceptable. So as a consequence, unsurprisingly, most of the world's mining is in lightly regulated areas that are often fragile ecosystems in South America, Africa, Asia, and also where, to be frank, a lot of corruption goes on. It's there, and a lot of practices that we would be shocked at if we paid attention. Everything from indentured servitude to outright child labor in many mines around the world. Not all, but many, and it's well documented. It's not a mystery. This is and fixing that by virtue signaling that we're going to want to source, ethically responsible mining will just result in fraud and papering over what's actually happening.
Well, I know back when they were strip mining the tar sands up in Canada,
they still are.
Yeah. And there were a lot of environmentalist groups that were coming out, because if you've ever seen strip mining, I mean, it's pretty invasive as far as, taking down trees and stuff and mining that way. And of course, you heard a lot of the environmentalists come out, but you don't hear a lot, when we're talking about these minerals. Is that because a lot of it's done in countries that are not in the U.S. and so they just don't report on it?
You're right. You don't hear a lot about it. You hear some. I mean, I will give, I don't often give credit to the New York Times and the Washington Post, Time Magazine and Bloomberg, but I'll give them all credit in that if you look, and you'll find that in the recent months, in the last year, they've sent investigative journalism teams to these parts of the world where the mining is going on. To Indonesia, the #1 nickel miner, to Chile, the #1 copper miner and lithium producer, and to different parts of the planet where these mines are, and exposing and being shocked, frankly. They're shocked at the magnitude of the challenge, the environmental destruction in many cases, the kinds of labor practices. So there's some attention being brought to it now, but it usually results in I would call feckless responses. Oh, well, we'll reduce the amount of mining we need by recycling, and we'll issue mandates that they be ethically mined materials. Well, the latter, sure, you should do that, but we know that that's very ineffective. The mining companies that are practicing these bad practices, just hide them and hide behind NGOs giving them fake labels, in effect. This was well documented in a book I reviewed for the Wall Street Journal, called Cobalt Red. The professor of slavery, that's what his specialty is in England, traveled to Congo to look at cobalt mines. And it's a disturbing book, well done. If people want to understand what's happening in cobalt mining, and cobalt is essential to most batteries in the lithium space, not all. You can do without cobalt, but you use instead of cobalt often is nickel. So you can go visit nickel mines and find similar shocking things. And none of it's possible without copper. All the electrification, whether it's the electric motor, the anodes and cathodes take aluminum and copper in the battery, the chargers take copper, the distribution wires in the grid take copper. Copper is the long pole, and copper is a challenge. And meanwhile, in America, 3 mines that went through multi-year, multi-million-dollar approval processes over the last decade, as their permits were issued in the last 12 months, the current administration's EPA just summarily canceled the permits illegally, I add, and they'll ultimately win lawsuits to get reinstated, but not until they spend years and millions in litigation against this what is fundamentally an illegal act. So the administration here is doing sort of we'll call it a schizophrenic approach to the minerals challenge for mining to supply all the electric vehicle batteries. On one hand, they're providing some subsidies to the battery factories to make them, and using the Defense Production Act to sprinkle a few $1 million here and there at future mines in America. But in the meantime, all the materials will have to come from overseas, 90% of it. And between 50 and 80% of the refining of those materials will take place in China, which is the dominant energy minerals refiner. Everyone knows this in the technical community. Everyone knows this in the Department of Energy. Everyone knows this in the International Energy Agency. So they hand wave solutions that might work eventually, like in a decade or two. But for the next decade, this is a full-on program to increase mining globally, export jobs, and export pollution.
Well, what is getting back to the auto workers and talking a little bit about that, as far as the reason why they're striking is that they claim that, these electric vehicles, they're not going to need as many employees going forward in the future. Is that because a lot of it is manufactured overseas?
It's half that. Exactly. It's the supply chain. The parts for a complicated electric vehicle are the chemical parts, if you like, the separators and all the different components in the battery, a lot of them fabricated in China, and the chemical components, because that's how you make the battery with a soup of specialty chemicals, are also fabricated overseas and imported to assemble here. So that's half the story. The other half of the story is that the automakers have done joint venture deals, often with Chinese battery makers and some other Japanese and South Korean battery makers, to assemble joint venture battery assembly plants that are outside of the union control. So part of the strike is to bring those parts, because that's part of the assembly system, bring that under union labor and union negotiation, which I think GM has conceded they may now do because of the strike. And they're doing that not because the EV has less labor, because they move the labor from the engine and transmission plant, simplistically. You have an internal combustion engine and a transmission. We took the engine and transmission plant. We don't use that. Now we're going to use a battery assembly and electric motor plant, which is not under the union control. So they just want to get a piece of that. I get it. But in terms of it being simpler, here's just a fact that's can be easily checked. The number of people working in a Tesla battery and electric motor plant, that's the equivalent of the engine and transmission plant. There's twice as many people to produce the same number of drivetrains in a Tesla plant as there are in a conventional engine and transmission plant. Twice as many.
Wow. So
the battery line is more labor intensive so far. Now, I think they'll eventually get it down to the labor intensity of internal combustion engine transmission and plant, because the internal combustion engine guys have an advantage. They've been at it for 100 years and really taken a lot of the labor out of it. The battery assembly and the motor, both of those are relatively old technologies, but not as old as an internal combustion engine. So They'll get better, and they might get all the way down to the labor efficiency, but it's actually the inverse of the claim. There's actually more labor. And if you add in the labor, to your point, upstream in the mineral refining part, which you necessarily need to do. You can do that for conventional car. Upstream, it's mostly steel. 85% of the weight of a conventional car is steel and iron, right?
Right.
That's not true for an electric vehicle. About 70% of the weight are copper, nickel, aluminum. We also know a lot about the labor for that. It's about 40 times, not a little bit more, 40 times more labor per car in the upstream metals to make an EV compared to the upstream metals to make a conventional car. But that's also being shipped offshore. We're about 80% domestically independent for steel. The metals, put differently, America produces more than 3/4 of the steel it consumes. So it's the domestic labor is here. America does not produce all the other refined minerals and metals here that are needed for electric vehicles. So the union, I think, correctly has noticed all this, and so we'll see. And it's not that you can get their point. The problem they're going to have is as you raise the cost of assembling batteries here, is that it'll just mean the vehicles themselves will get more expensive, not cheaper, because we'll be importing both minerals from other people who have pricing power, and we'll be using our more expensive labor than labor overseas. It'll be a double whammy. So instead of EVs getting cheaper by 2030, when you won't be allowed to buy an internal combustion engine, they'll be a lot more expensive. So you'll have a choice of buying a more expensive American car or a cheap Chinese EV, or the government will be forced to continue with infinite subsidies to make up the difference.
Now, do you think this is going to destroy the American auto industry?
I think yes. I think we're moving on a path. We haven't crossed the tipping point yet. That the amount of losses that are being incurred by the major U.S. automakers, and they are incurring losses. They're being candid about this. They're losing billions of dollars a quarter, not millions. Even with all the subsidies and the grants, they're losing billions of dollars every quarter on manufacturing EVs. If this continues, it's not beyond the realm that as the train wreck happens on all the supply chain, that we see the bankruptcy of major U.S. automakers. And the question on the table will be whether there'll be the political appetite to again bail out U.S. automakers. Or in fact, they just finally succumb. And this time it won't be succumbing to foreign competition. It'll be succumbing to the interference of government into industrial economy such that we can't compete.
Yeah, because I had read an article where China, I guess, is pushing to develop a electric car that's going to cost around $30,000, which is going to, completely, I don't know if it's going to destroy the American auto industry, but they're going to take over a lot of that market share.
Well, they already have. So BYD already produces a low $30,000 EV. It's possible with the right supply chain, and they have it because it's their supply chain to produce a low-cost EV. And that EV is being exported into European, especially South American markets. And I know they would have the appetite to export it here. But, the politician's solution for that is easy. They'll be dumping, which is true. They'll be dumping EVs here because the supply chain advantage they have with subsidized refining and subsidized mining in China means that they are probably by WTO standards, in fact, dumping. So you'll hit them with a tariff. So the $34,000 Chinese EV becomes the $50,000 EV, and the Ford EV is $50,000. So instead of having the option of buying a $22,000 entry-level car, the only entry-level car you'll be able to buy in 5 years will be a $50,000 car, whether it's Chinese or American. This is economically destructive, and the effect of that will be fewer cars will be bought, obviously, because people can't afford them, and they'll keep their used car longer. And for those who want to buy a new car, which will be used, the cost of used cars will go up because there'll be fewer cars available to be purchased at all. If you can't manufacture an internal combustion engine, the value of those that are already manufactured will rise, and will turn America into Cuba, where Cuba in 1959 banned the import of any car from America, and they kept 1959 Chevys, famously, as you know, to this day.
Yeah. Well, when you look at the industry overall, and I'm talking about the oil and gas industry now and the fossil fuel industry, and the auto industry, I mean, shouldn't they be developing products that people want to buy instead of trying to push products onto companies? Because now you see a shift. I think you're starting to see a shift. You see Exxon this week coming out and, merging or buying, Pioneer.
A big buy.
You see Shell, where they've now came out and says, we're moving away from offshore wind because we just can't make a profit at it.
Right.
I mean, do you think you're going to see something similar in the auto industry where these the CEOs have got to wake up and say, we just can't make money at this. We got to go back to what we can make money doing. It's building, combustion engine cars. Do you see that happening?
I think eventually, you could color me cynical. I think the political and economic pressure to do what they're doing is overwhelming right now. So we're in early days of the subsidies, even though it's pretty hypertrophied. The money hasn't been fully spent yet, because we're only talking, right, in the last first half of this year, roughly 6% of U.S. new vehicle purchases were electric. But more important than that, to your earlier comment, those are dominantly in the luxury car category. 90% of the vehicles that are electric that are sold in America are luxury vehicles, and 75% of luxury cars first half of this year were electric. And most of those were Teslas. So this is a Tesla story in America, and it's a dominantly Tesla story in Europe, not so much in China. So eventually, the reality will rear up its ugly head in terms of the real costs, the supply chain costs, the import costs, labor costs. And the automakers, color me cynical, will be able to say, look, we tried. You pushed us in the box. We did our best. We spent billions. We lost billions. We can't control the supply chain for the automakers. We don't mine copper. We don't refine lithium. If you want us to start a lithium refinery, which Elon Musk has done, you give us some money. They'll be able to say, we tried, and now you got to rescue us because we did what you told us. Then the question is a political gamble. Will the government help and rescue them if they're really damaged, or will they be able to simply walk away or do what Ford might be setting their organizational structure up to do, which is to just carve off the electric vehicle business because they have a separate vertical for that, and say, look, we'll separate that as a separately traded stock. You can buy Ford electric, or you can buy Ford conventional. You choose, you investors, you go ahead. That'd be a very wise strategy if they do that. I hope they do for their sake. But eventually reality will be what it is. So we have to guess now whether or not we believe the constant invocation, the technology will get better and it'll make it cheaper. As we go to volumes, the batteries get cheaper. So all those claims which are being bandied about, I think are provably misguided or wrong. But again, we're in the category of making a forecast. So, like all forecasts, they're subject to variables that people reasonably say, well, maybe you're wrong, Mills. Maybe copper gets cheap. Okay, tell me the evidence of why copper gets cheap. It's just a supply-demand thing, and is the supply increasing? Because its demand's going to go up off the charts, 200-300% in 5 to 10 years. This is crazy increase in copper demand in a short term. Doesn't mean you can't ever make the copper. Give me a few decades, do it. But in 8 years, zero evidence. Show me the evidence. There's no evidence. So the automakers have to know this, to your point. I can't believe they're not stupid. Nothing I'm saying is political in the sense that I'm making stuff up. They know if they're listening to us talk, they know that I'm telling the truth. They're not stupid, and they know there's a train wreck coming. So what are they thinking? Well, I think they're under a lot of pressure. They're being handed a lot of money. It's pretty hard to resist. The magnitude of the political pressures are being brought to bear in Europe and here. And this is not just a Biden administration, right? This is many states, 12 states have said they're going to ban internal combustion engines. Well, what if they stick to their guns and actually ban them? You got to have something to sell in those states.
Yeah. Well, I guess it all comes down to who's in power, right? Because we seem to swing like a pendulum, depending on what party's in power. Well, we're going to move this direction and we're going to spend all this money trying to reduce, carbon emissions, which, unless China and India actually get serious about it. I mean, we can spend all the money here in the United States we want. I mean, we've got 300 million people, compared to billions of people around the world that,
Yep.
have said,
Right.
count us out. We're a
Well,
developing nation.
Billions of people that are burning more coal. Let's be clear, China is building and commissioning about a coal plant a week right now, a gigawatt scale coal plant. Look, that is the right question. It's a global issue that is being motivated by the global emissions of CO2. It is knowable and unavoidable, to your point, that even if the claimed reductions of CO2 emissions happen over the next decade from the trillions we're going to spend on decarbonization, even if those happen, the increased emissions from China alone over that same decade are roughly tenfold more than what we're going to reduce. And they are not bankrupting their economy to make a, quote, energy transition. They're promising to do something about it starting 10 years from now.
Yeah.
After the increased emissions from China, this is an interesting calibration point. In one decade, China's increased emissions of CO2 are greater than the emissions of England cumulatively since the Industrial Revolution. So this kind of asymmetry would at least make you step back, regardless of what you think about whether we should reduce CO2 emissions or not, to ask the question, it's a bang for the buck question. If you wanted to spend this much money and cut CO2 emissions, I'll give an easy solution, other than you can provide incentives to hybrid and more efficient internal combustion engines and get a lot of bang for the buck. But the biggest bang for the buck would be to take every dollar we're going to spend on the, quote, energy transition and use it to subsidize. I'm not a fan of doing this. I'm just saying this is a thought experiment. Subsidize the production and the export of LNG so that countries that are planning to burn more coal would have burner tip parity with US LNG. That would be cheaper than what we're doing. And it would cut CO2 emissions for sure by a greater amount.
That makes a lot of sense. This experiment has already been tried, right? I mean, Germany is literally bankrupt, but you don't hear people saying that. I mean, they spent trillions of dollars on trying to move to this green energy transformation, right. And they pretty much bankrupted their country. Right. But you don't hear that in the news, right?
If you read the European news, you do. The European EU is very worried. Germany's worried. They are using the words deindustrialize. They're deindustrializing entirely because of energy costs. You can't blame Putin directly because the energy policies of Europe, as their own minister pointed out, they subsidized the spending on wind and solar on the backs of cheap, discounted Russian gas. Okay, then it's your point. They spent trillions of dollars. Why is energy not cheaper? Well, their electric bills went up. The residential electric bills went up 400% in the last decade. 400%. So they're paying in U.S. dollar equivalent terms almost $0.50 a kilowatt hour for electricity. It's causing deindustrialization and destabilization. And after trillions of dollars, what they've got is an energy economy which gets 6% of its primary energy from wind and solar and batteries. 6%. That's it. This is hardly a transition, right? It's an economically destructive experiment that we're going to try to follow. I think this is the problem. We're not doing it with better technology. And it's not that wind and solar are cheaper than what Germany would spend. It's getting more expensive, not cheaper right now because of, again, commodity prices and now capital costs. They built windmills at a time when you had 0% interest. So you build capital intensive things on 0% money. That looks pretty good. You start spending billions of dollars a week on 8% money is pretty ugly, which is why a lot of the auctions are collapsing because the economics are falling apart.
So how can they continue to develop better technology for solar and better technology for wind, or are we kind of at a point where we've developed the technology now, but it's still only 20% of our total electricity that we use here in the U.S.? I mean, is that going to get better, or is it going to cost more money?
So wind and solar in America are under 10%, well, 10 or 11% of electricity.
10 or 11.
So, yes, so that makes it about 3% of our total energy supply. The challenge is in the semantics of what we mean by technology getting better. Of course, technology will get better for wind and solar, for batteries. Of course it does. The question you'd want to know is, where are you on the technology getting better curve, right? Are you on the asymptote where you have incremental improvements? Or are you in the early days where you have big improvements? We know for a fact that we're on the asymptote, that wind and solar are now like oil and gas and like conventional engines. And we're a mature industry where the technology gets incrementally better each year through economies and through engineering and management, all kinds of things that we do in all forms of manufacturing. But there's no 10x gains left like there were in the early days of wind and solar. That, it was a 10x reduction in cost per kilowatt. There are none left because the physics doesn't permit it.
Well, that's interesting, how that, we continue throwing money at this, utopia, I guess, is what we're considering it to be. But it doesn't look like that as we move forward that, it's going to get a lot cheaper, right? It's not going to get to the point where nobody has an electric bill. I guess that's what the government wants you to think, that you're not going to have an electric bill. You're just going to basically live, utilities free, right?
You can in theory try to subsidize everything forever, but that we know that, you don't have to be an economist to know that'll collapse on its own weight. A single fact that one would have to have in one's head, then you'll know why the trope that technology will get better, what it really means. Let's do electric vehicles, since that's the subject du jour, given the strike. So about 70% of the cost of making an EV battery, between 70 and 80% of the cost of its production is in the purchase of its raw materials. So if you do the engineering thinking on this, that means that fundamentally the future cost of the battery is almost entirely dominated by the future cost of the raw materials, which is not determined by the manufacturer, but it's determined by other companies that do the mining and refining. So the future cost of EVs, put simply, is now in the hands of the world's mining industry. So you're making guesses about the future cost of materials. So even if you make the manufacturing process twice as economically efficient, right? So the 30%, you cut that in half. Well, okay, do the math. That's 15% reduction in cost. But what's going to happen to the bill of materials? The 75% that's the bill of materials for, if they go up 15%, they're obviously going to raise the cost of the car because this is arithmetic 101. It's 15% of a bigger number, a bigger share. And to think that mineral prices are only going to go up 15 or 20%, when demand is going to go up somewhere from 400 to 7,000% to make all these EV batteries, is profoundly naive and misguided. So we have this. So you can invoke, the technology will get better. We'll make a different kind of battery, with different minerals and requiring fewer minerals per kilowatt hour. Well, of course you can do that. Chemistry always gets better. You can imagine battery chemistry that's twice as efficient in terms of the reduction of materials per unit of energy stored. But they don't exist yet. They take a long time to develop and perfect and manufacture at scale. They may eventually exist. In fact, they probably will exist within the next decade. So if that's what you think solves the problem, well, then wait till they exist, because stimulating the production of yesterday's technology doesn't create tomorrow's technology. It never has. That's not how innovation works.
Well, I really only have one other question for you. I could sit here and talk to you all day about this, but do we even have enough of these materials to build the amount of batteries they're projecting we're going to need?
So again, I got to use a caveat. Are we producing enough materials? Or planning to produce? The answer is unequivocally and well known, no. The world is not now mining, nor planning to mine, nor announcing plans to mine enough copper, manganese, nickel, lithium. Lithium is the easiest one, by the way, to expand. It's not the long pole in the tent. It's the other heavy metals that are hard. So we know for a fact, the data are out there. Wood Mackenzie's done great work on this, so they should pay me a commission, give them all the promotion I'm giving them. They've done great work, as has Platts, Dan Jurgens, who's vice chairman there, of mapping out the state of the world's mining industry. It is a fact. The world is not now mining nor planning to mine a sufficient quantity of materials to make this many amount of EVs people imagine. Different question. Does enough material exist in the Earth's crust to do that? Well, sure. I'm the polar opposite of a Malthusian in the old Club of Rome limits to growth tradition. What you need to know in the real world is how long does it take to find, commission, and build a mine? And we have lots of data on that. It takes more than a decade. The average is 16 years globally. So if we start now, and we sort of are, you could imagine a lot more mining in the next decade. But we've got the mandates to stop producing internal combustion engines happening within that decade before the mines are even open, begin making the materials. It's you have to use words like crazy and insane to say, well, what are people thinking? This will not end well, because you can't wave a wand and make all these things get resolved overnight. There's no amount of subsidies that can make a difference fast enough to meet these ambitions. So it's another way of saying they won't happen. Then the question you'd ask is, if you're an investor or a policymaker, what will the consequence of it not happening be? And this is something we should be thinking a lot more about than trying to pretend it's going to happen.
Yeah, and isn't that going to put us on the road to bankruptcy if we're not already on that road now here in the U.S.? Because the American taxpayer can only make so much money, right? I mean, print so much.
Well, you can't keep printing money and subsidizing everything. At some point, the subsidies have to end, and that's the issue. Is that if you have expanding costs, that means the subsidies aren't going to solve any problem of making things affordable, and you either expand the subsidies or you bail out. I think there's no political appetite to expand the subsidies beyond the trillions we're already at. A lot of them probably go away. So if you're betting on this, you have to bet, when does a train wreck happen? Because a lot of people would say, well, look at copper prices. They haven't gone up as much as you imply. Well, no, because we only got 2% of the world's cars at the moment are electric, and they're cars from wealthy people willing to pay up. And the call on copper, whether it's for motors or batteries or for wind turbines, is still in the noise, because we're still talking a few percent of the global energy system. You start making it 10%. There's sort of a tipping point. Maybe it's around 10%. Once you get to double-digit percentages of vehicles on the road and power systems for the total energy economy, then you begin to get calls on metals that are consequential. And when does that happen? You can model this probably as soon as 2 years.
Well, it's going to have to happen pretty soon, because obviously, like you said, they're going to do away with the combustion engine. So unless we're all going to be walking, they're going to be building a lot more electric cars.
Well, they want you to walk and take a Lime scooter and ride a bicycle. That's the expressed opinion and position of the energy transitionists. You should do a lot more. I like walking, but I want to walk voluntarily.
Yeah, I know here in Texas it's kind of hot in August to walk.
I'd say, the Lime scooter in August in Texas is not a whole lot of fun.
Well, Mark, I sure enjoyed having you on the show today, and I'd love to have you back in the future. Could you tell our listeners how to follow you?
Sure. A lot of my stuff can be found just by putting Mark P. Mills in the Google search, but I have a website called tech-pundit. That's where my writing and lectures are. And the Manhattan Institute website has a lot of my stuff, because I'm a senior fellow there. And I do a podcast too, just like you. I have one called The Last Optimist.
Right.
You can find that on all the usual platforms, from Apple to Ricochet and others. And you can imagine why it's titled The Last Optimist.
Well, it's great having you on today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Good to talk.
You've been listening to The Energy Show with REI Energy. Energize your investments and maximize your tax deductions. To learn more, go to reienergy.com.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.